Right, let's move on. We have been to South Thailand and considered some of the methodological decisions that I made when I wrote my book. We've looked at some of the methodological discussions done by an anthropologist who studied Buddhist nuns in central Thailand. And we've summarised quite a long discussion of all of the ups and downs that a Western Dutch woman just after 9/11 in India faced when she was trying to gain access to women's religious schools, Islamic religious schools in India, and all the ups and downs and all the things that she went through before she could really have comfortable access. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be looking at a book called Houses in Motion, The Experience of Place and the Problem of Belief in Urban Malaysia, and it's written by Andrew Backstrom. And let's just go to full screen, and what I'm going to do is, well, I really do hope that you can be reading through these books yourself. You can access them, no problem. So he explains the findings of this ethnography are based on 14 months of field research conducted for this project over 2 periods of residence in a part of KL called Brickfields. And if you've been to KL, Brickfields is right next to the train station. Survey work for the project was conducted during November and December 2000, and the extended period of data collection took place between October 2001 and September 2002. 90 ethnographic interviews with 53 different interview subjects were completed during this period. The duration of these interviews varied, lasting from 1 hour to, in an extreme case, 9 hours. When possible, a second interview was held, and in several cases I conducted numerous interviews with the same subject during the period of field research. These figures do not include numerous meetings and ceremonies attended, informal conversations and other activities where I was a participant. A participant. These public events were nonetheless key sites of data collection and were recorded in field notes and through other modes of evidence collecting, including video recording where appropriate. Most of the interviews conducted for the project were in public settings. This was in keeping with the established social rhythms of the neighbourhood, and that nearly all informal social contact between friends would happen in local tea shops, eateries and food stalls. The marked local preference for conversing in public required me to approach each interview with a flexibility that would allow me to follow the interview protocols that I had established in advance, while also taking into account the specific sites in which individual interlocutors or informants preferred to sit down and talk. In this context, it was often difficult to predict if any informant or interlocutor would be alone or with friends, how long I had to conduct the interview, and if it would be possible to broach sensitive subjects for discussing in these settings. In most cases, these variables did not preclude frank discussion, although in nearly every case I would attempt to conduct a second private interview in the house of the person or in some other private setting. After the initial interview, most of my interlocutors consented to a second private interview. It was rare for my interview subjects to consent to private interviews without having met in public first. He explains, my own experience My own experience in meeting and interviewing Brickfield's residents is reflected in the theoretical frameworks and conclusions that constitute the body of this work in two ways. First, local understandings of community are explicitly linked to forms of social space that allowed for regular informal contacts in the context of eating, drinking, shopping, and generally circulating through the space and own one's pace and on foot. As it is common for individuals or entire families to spend every day in such places for the purposes of meeting others socially, my requests for interviews were often folded into the typical rhythm of the neighbourhood. The established social pattern would often emerge as an explicit point of conversation during my interview, and that efforts to reorganise the space of Brickfields around KL Central and Monorail were understood as threatening the informal mode of socialising. Although seldom articulated as directly as the first point, I understand the second reason for this form of contact as necessarily seen and being seen. So he explains, although I seldom encountered one open suspicion or hostility in regards to the research, it was nevertheless important for my interlocutors for their contact with me, that their contact with me could not be coded as something fully private or as encounters that were happening behind closed doors. The residents consistently had a well-formed image of who a social scientist was and what sort of work they did in a context of change driven by the opinions and studies of experts who were largely inaccessible to area inhabitants. It was very important for my own contacts and activities in the neighbourhood to be open and observable to the community at large, as this inaccessibility was widely understood as a form of injustice due to its failure to address the community. It was crucial that my methods and activities in the area did not inadvertently replicate or felt neglect or unfairness. Although the expectation that most of my initial contacts with people would be in public places required rethinking certain methodological strategies, this mode of engagement proved to be advantageous in a number of ways. One clear benefit is that the openness of most of my data collection allowed me to interview a roughly even number of men and women in this project, meeting in public places and oftentimes in small groups, allowed this male researcher to conduct and interview women without placing potential female subjects in awkward situations. This is not to say that gender played no role in the course of my research. On the contrary, it was still apparent that even follow-up interviews with female subjects often could not be one-on-one encounters. However, as my contacts with male interlocutors often followed the same pattern, gender difference did not emerge as an obstacle to my research. Interestingly, for women surveyed for this project, gender differences did not consistently emerge as a separate theme in their narratives of how notions of community, law and justice were experienced in the context of urban life in Brickfields. In part, this is due to the fact that the research was not originally conceived as a work centred on gender difference. Let's go on. All of the interviews in the subjects were conducted in either English or Malay, Bahasa Malaysia. Often, it is often the case in everyday conversation, both languages were in use, although one nearly always tended to predominate over the other. My approach regarding which language to choose to conduct my interview was to deploy the language the interlocutor sought to use in conversing with me. I would always make it clear that the interview could take place in either Malay or English, as English remains widely spoken in everyday contexts. Many of my informants were conducted in this language. In only one instance did an interview subject through the use of did I interview a subject through the use of a translator, and that was when they were more interested, comfortable in speaking Tamil. Although most of the ethnographic data collected, I did conduct a number of interviews outside the community, not just Brickfields. Those interviews were primarily with government officials, political, religious leaders, and property developers. So he mentions that there are other places. Basic population and household survey data was obtained by a number of officers, and he details where the primary and secondary source materials were collected, and he talks about specific libraries, university and public national libraries that he used. Okay, so this is a very interesting piece of work, and the main guts of this person's methodological discussion, Richard Bockstrom's methodological discussion, centre around the way in which the daily life of Brickfields, and if you go to the central train station in KL, you will see it is to one side of it, and it is a predominantly Indian community, and there are piles of tea shops, piles of restaurants, piles of places to sit, and he conducted his research in those places. Initially, that's where he was conducting them. After that, follow-up interviews in their houses, because it was public, people could see what he was doing. It was easier for him to interview women, in addition to him studying, primarily doing his research in Brickfields, outside interviews with key informants. He also provides details about the languages used. He also mentions the places where he obtained important other primary and secondary documents. And so this is another example of how one particular ethnographer conducted ethnographic research in a particular way, and his methods were informed by two things. He needed specific amounts of data, and so he used methods to get that data to answer his question, but the place where he was made it easier for him to contact this data in this particular way. And so that is the fourth monograph that we have looked at, and let's go on to the next one soon.